Learning objective number 1, to describe the anatomy of the spinal cord. The spinal cord contains a bundle of nerves suspended in cerebrospinal fluid which protects and nourishes the cord. The spinal cord is further protected by the same meninges or membranes which surround the brain, as well as the vertebral bodies or the vertebra. Nerves enter and exit the spinal cord in pairs and extend out to various parts of the body where they transmit sensory information from receptors to the central nervous system and motor output from the central nervous system to the effectors. So we will begin to look at the anatomy of the spinal cord by first looking at its protective structures. Like brain tissue, the tissue of the spinal cord is very delicate and does not respond well to injury or damage. Accordingly, nervous tissue requires considerable protection. So the spinal cord is located within the vertebral canal of the vertebral column. The vertebral canal is formed by the vertebral foramen, or this hole here. And when all of the vertebrae are stacked one on top of each other, they form a bit of a tunnel through which the spinal cord can run through. When the vertebrae are aligned in this type of fashion, they also form the intervertebral foramen, or foramina for plural, which is just the hole or the holes in between the vertebra. Through the intervertebral foramen or foramina is where the spinal nerves will enter and exit the spinal cord. So the bone surrounding the vertebral canal or the foramen provides a sturdy shelter for the enclosed spinal cord, but surrounding vertebral ligaments, the meninges and the cerebrospinal fluid will provide some additional protection. So the second protective layer surrounding the spinal cord are the meninges, and these are the same three membranes that surround the brain. So the spinal meninges are continuous with the cranial meninges, or the meninges of the brain, and they also cover the spinal nerves to the point where they exit the vertebral column through those intervertebral foramina. As a reminder, the most superficial or outer layer of the meninges is the dura mater. It's continuous with the epineuron, which is the outer connective tissue layer surrounding a spinal nerve. The middle layer is our arachnoid mater, which is the thin spiderweb-like layer. And then the innermost layer, which adheres directly onto the tissue of the spinal cord, is the pia mater. And between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater is where the cerebrospinal fluid will circulate, which, as we discussed previously, protects that underlying nervous tissue in several different ways. Now, in the spinal cord, between the dura mater and then the wall of the vertebral canal is also another cushiony layer of fat and connective tissue. This space we call the epidural space. Moving on to the external anatomy of the spinal cord, and the spinal cord extends from the medulla oblongata, which is that very bottom of the brainstem, down to the inferior border of the second lumbar vertebra, which are the large vertebra in your lower back. In babies and infants, the spinal cord extends further down into the vertebral canal. However, during childhood, elongation of the spinal cord stops, but growth of the vertebral column, so the bone, will continue. So the spinal cord in an adult does not actually extend the entire length of the vertebra or the spine in an adult. The spinal cord is roughly oval in shape with a maximum diameter of about 1.5 centimetres, and smaller or thinner regions in the thoracic region, so around the ribs, as well as its inferior tip. Now, when the spinal cord is viewed externally, there are two sections within the spinal cord where it is obviously thicker. The first is the cervical enlargement. This is in the lower neck region. And nerves to and from the upper limbs arise from the cervical enlargement, which is why it is thicker in this area. So there's more sensory neurons coming from the upper limbs, and there's more motor neurons needing to go to those upper limbs. The inferior enlargement is called the lumbar enlargement, which is found at the bottom level, or the level, of the bottom 3 ribs. And here, this is where the nerves to and from the lower limbs, so your legs, will arise. Looking now at the spinal cord internally, and a transverse section, so that's the view we've got here, reveals regions of white matter that surround an inner core butterfly shape of grey matter. A reminder that white matter is made up of myelinated axons, and grey matter is unmyelinated axons, neuron cell bodies, dendrites, axon terminals, and neuroglia. So like in the brain, in the grey matter of the spinal cord, we have clusters of neuron cell bodies which form functional groups called nuclei. Sensory nuclei receive input from receptors via sensory neurons, and motor nuclei provide output to effector tissues via motor neurons. So the grey matter on each side of the spinal cord is subdivided into regions which we call horns, so Horns, like horns on a bull. The posterior or the dorsal horn contains cell bodies and axons of interneurons, as well as axons of incoming sensory neurons. So this blue line here is an incoming sensory neuron. This purple line here is one of our interneurons, so connecting a sensory and a motor neuron. The anterior or the ventral grey horns, so these 2 bits here, contain somatic motor nuclei. And so these are clusters of cell bodies of somatic motor neurons that provide the nerve impulses for the contraction of skeletal muscles, so the muscles that we can voluntarily contract. Between the posterior and the anterior grey horns are our lateral grey horns. These are found on both sides of the spinal cord, but it was just easier to point it out on one side here. The lateral grey horns are present only in the thoracic or the rib region and the upper lumbar or the lower back segments of the spinal cord. And the lateral grey horn contains autonomic motor nuclei. So these are clusters of cell bodies of autonomic motor neurons that regulate the activity of cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. So those effectors that we can't consciously control. The white matter, like the grey matter, is also organised into regions. The anterior and the posterior grey horns divide the white matter on each side into 3 broad areas, which we call columns. The anterior or the ventral column, the posterior or the dorsal column, and then the lateral columns, which again occur on both sides, but I've only labelled on this top side here. So each column contains distinct bundles of axons with a common origin and destination, and which carries similar types of information. Within the central nervous system, we call these bundles tracks. And we will look at each of these tracks in much more detail when we get to the module about neural pathways. Tracks consisting of axons carrying nerve impulses from the brain are called motor or descending tracks. Sensory or ascending tracks consist of axons that conduct nerve impulses from receptors up towards the brain. Lastly, in terms of our spinal cord anatomy, emerging from the spinal cord are spinal nerves. So these are the paths of communication between the spinal cord and then the specific regions of the body. And we will look at spinal nerves in more detail in the next learning objective, but very briefly, 31 pairs of spinal nerves emerge from the spinal cord at regular intervals through those intervertebral foramina, those little holes between the vertebrae. 2 bundles of axons called roots connect each spinal nerve to each segment of the spinal cord by even smaller bundles of axons called rootlets. So the roots are these bits here. The rootlets are these bits here. The posterior or the dorsal root and rootlets contain only sensory axons, which again are represented by this blue line here. So this is incoming sensory information. Each posterior root also has a swelling, so you can see this enlarged section here, and this contains the cell bodies of sensory neurons. This is because most sensory neurons are unipolar neurons, where the cell body of the neuron actually sits off to the side, and the axons, the dendrites, and the axon terminals are all structured in one kind of continuous process emerging from the cell body. The anterior or the ventral root and rootlets contain axons of motor neurons, so they're represented by these red and green lines here. And these conduct nerve impulses from the central nervous system to the effectors, which are our muscles and our glands. So if you are looking at a segment of the spinal cord and you're unsure which side is anterior and which side is posterior, you can always identify this swelling or the posterior or dorsal root ganglion. You know that has to be at the back, so then you should be able to work out which side is the front. So once more, a bit of a summary of some of those new terms for you. I know there are quite a lot of them. I don't require you to know these definitions off by heart. This is simply a slide that you can refer back to when you're looking at that image of the spinal cord anatomy. So we have the vertebral foramen, which is the hole within the vertebral body or the vertebra through which the spinal cord runs. The intervertebral foramina, which are the holes formed by the adjacent vertebra through which the spinal nerves exit. The cervical enlargement, which is the enlargement or the thickening of the spinal cord where nerves to and from the upper limbs arise. The lumbar enlargement is that thickening a bit lower down in the spinal cord where the nerves to and from the lower limbs arise. Our posterior or our dorsal grey horn is the posterior or the back section of the grey matter in the spinal cord, which contains the cell bodies and axons of interneurons and also the axons of sensory neurons. The anterior or ventral grey horn is the front part of that grey matter, which contains the cell bodies of our somatic motor neurons. So these are the motor neurons that go to our skeletal muscle. We have the lateral grey horn, which are the two side parts of that grey matter, which we only find in the thoracic and the lumbar regions. These contains the cell bodies of our autonomic motor neurons, so the neurons that go to our muscles and glands that contract autonomically, so without our conscious voluntary control. And then we have the anterior, lateral and posterior right columns, which are the bundles of axons, which within the central nervous system we call tracts, that have a common origin and destination and which carry similar information. We then have a spinal nerve, which is a mixed both sensory and motor nerve that emerges from the spinal cord. The posterior root and rootlet is what attaches it into the spinal cord on the back and contains sensory neurons and transmits sensory nerve impulses to the central nervous system. Our posterior root ganglion is that swelling in the posterior root that contains the cell bodies of our sensory neurons, and also a great way to identify which part of the spinal cord is anterior and posterior. And finally, our anterior root and rootlet, which is the part that that attaches the front part of that spinal nerve to the spinal cord and contains motor neurons and transmits motor